Um, for those of you who may not have been at earlier sessions, I'm Ted Landsmark. I am the director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy here at the university. I'm sorry I missed last week's class, which I understand was highly engaging, and you're back for more, which is great. One logistical announcement or reminder, we normally meet on Wednesday evenings. We will do that again next week, but in the week after, this class will take place on Monday evening. That's the first Monday in February. And that's because our speaker was only available on that Monday evening. I'm going to turn this over in just a moment to Jeremy, but I do have to make one comment about my absence last week. I was at a conference in San Diego with a group of design and planning professionals where we got into some discussions of the role of cybersecurity in manipulating the way we go about doing planning and doing design. And we talked at some length about how ransomware is reshaping a number of our policy and planning processes in ways that are unanticipated and fundamentally negative. And I can assure you that at future sessions, not of this semester's class, but as we move forward, we will be talking increasingly about technology and the global issues involved in cybersecurity. So with that, I will turn tonight's session over to our law school dean, Jeremy Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Ted, and thanks for giving us this opportunity, and thank all of you for being here. We're just delighted to see so many of you here to talk today about the rule of law in authoritarian regimes. As we have done in previous sessions, we're going to start with some clips, but I thought I would just say a couple of things about how and why we chose this topic. As I said, we're going to start, as we have done the last two sessions, with some film clips, but I just want to say a couple of things about how and why we chose the topic of the rule of law in authoritarian regimes. I think many of us believe that we have some basic understanding of what it would be like to live in a society that had no rule of law at all. The cops could come and drag you out of your home or out of a business at any time, lock you up. You would have no recourse. If you wanted to do something for which you required government permission, you might need to pay a bribe. Your property would be not secure, and if someone else more powerful or connected to the regime needed it, it might suddenly disappear. And so, because none of those things are happening right now, it might feel to us as though all of this talk about the decline of the rule of law is over-exaggerated. It's just people who are politically dissatisfied with the current president and the current Congress, and it's not really a set of rule of law issues. And so one of the things that we want to show today is that even authoritarian regimes have many valuable uses for, if not the rule of law as we might ideally conceive it, at least the appearance of the rule of law to calm everybody down. So you might feel powerless if a cop dragged you out of your home and threw you in jail, but you'd feel even more powerless if then you were hauled in front of a judge with black robes in an august setting, and the judge told you, even though you'd done nothing wrong, that you deserve to be in jail. So in that sense, the judge and the appearance of the rule of law would serve authoritarian goals rather than detract from them. Similarly, if an authoritarian regime wants to make it appear as though property is safe so that foreigners will invest or people from other countries will invest, the rule of law serves that legitimation function as well. The judges can be tools of social control for the autocratic leaders, and they also can serve as methods of funneling information to the people at the top who otherwise might fear as though people at the bureaucracy are hiding things from them, so they can allow lawsuits. So actually, there's lots of ways in which authoritarian regimes continue often to support the appearance of the rule of law, even though it doesn't feel chaotic and crazy like it might. And so as we look at what's happening in the country today, and I'm sure our speakers will talk about that, we can't be reassured simply by the fact that things aren't totally messed up. We actually have to be vigilant to support all the things that we talked about in the first week. And so that's the topic for today. And with that introduction, roll film.
Okay, so we have two great speakers today. First, we will be hearing from Professor Jeffrey Birds from the Department of History here at Northeastern University. He's also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Russia and the Soviet Union. His research is focused in international history of modern Russia and the Soviet Union, and his work is devoted to studies of collaboration in German-occupied Soviet zones during World War II and the post-war Soviet counterinsurgency in Western Ukraine. He has his PhD from Yale University, and we look forward to his talk with us. And following Professor Birds, we have Professor Margaret Wu, who is a professor of law at Northeastern University and the Associate Dean for Research and Interdisciplinary Education. She has her JD degree from New York University and an LLM from Georgetown. And she teaches civil procedure, administrative law, comparative law, and has published and spoken widely about China's legal reform and the rule of law in China, and her area is also comparative law. So really thrilled to have these two speakers. We are improvising a little bit, so we'll have them speak first, and then hopefully we can run the film before we open it up for conversation. So thank you.
I am an expert in counterinsurgency, but lately I've been moving towards internationalization, and particularly counterintelligence functions of the Soviet secret police in the Western borderland regions in the early Cold War period. So that I've worked a lot over the last 20 years in Western security archives, as well as up until 2002 or so when they were still accessible, post-Soviet security archives on spies and the early spy war as well. And so my work tends to include a lot of data to show what's happening in the suspension of a rule of law. I think to a certain extent when we put Russia and the Soviet Union under the classification of an authoritarian system, automatically we're prejudging the nature of the system itself. And so I want to dispel that myth from the very beginning, because I think certain things are imposed when we look at the history of Russia and Russian geography. In the history of the world, no country has grown faster and longer than the Russian Empire. Between 1581 and 1899, Russia's Asian territory, Central Asia, the so-called Great Game between India and South Asia, and the ever-expanding Russian Empire across it, led to an expansion of about 21,000 square miles each year as Russia moved into that zone. There was no particular plan of Russia's move into the Wild East. Usually it was like the old cowboys and Indian movies. They would get near a local warlord. The warlord felt threatened, would attack a Russian fort, and they would expand eastward into these zones. But because of this, over the course of those centuries, an empire that back in 1584 was about twice the size of modern Mexico, 1.5 million square miles. By 1899, it had grown 6 times to roughly 8.6 million square miles, extending, as we see, through 13 time zones from Poland over here all the way to the Sea of Japan, from the Arctic Circle all the way down into basically the Black Sea here, and as we see into Central Asia. This inevitably imposes constraints on the meaning of an authoritarian regime. The reality is that even in the 19th century, when Russia tried to Europeanize and follow the Rechtsstaat model, the German legal model, by introducing more and more officials per population, and that officialdom grew roughly 9 times over the course of the 19th century, Russia was still under-ruled with roughly 1/5 the number of state officials to population in comparison to any other European country. What I try to tell my students is we want to talk about Stalinism as the template for authoritarianism, but the reality is Stalin had much less authority than, say, compare the cameras associated with the Boston Marathon bombing. The nature of the powers of the state today are far greater precisely because of the advances in technology, so that even in a democratic country, the line between authoritarianism and democracy, I think, is much narrower, so that when we want to make some sort of demonization of the Soviet Union, understand it's within certain contexts when we approach it in this way. Russia will expand at the rate of 100 square miles or so a day between 1804 and 1913, in the eve of the First World War. What that means is it's very difficult to speak about a rule of law. What I tell my students is autocratic power is sacrosanct, but it's a written law, and it's a discontinuous pyramid. The autocrat, the Tsar, and then the Soviet leaders are of course the unquestioned leaders, but in the everyday lives of people, they're having very little contact with state officials all over the place, so that the myths of an authoritarian rule of law are real. When we look at crisis situations, periods of transition in the 20th century, I think it becomes even more clear the breakdown of law and how actually the breakdown of law tends to create an extremist response, and what I'm going to argue in 2 case studies today, popular support for the imposition of an authoritarian regime. And I'm not even dealing with the 3rd case. Vladimir Putin himself has done precisely this in his declaration of a war on terror against what he calls the Chechen bandits, banditi, and he tries to use this successfully in 2001, 2002 for the establishment of martial law inside Russia in order to consolidate authority with huge popular support throughout. And that's really the question on how this gets applied. And then I'm going to have a conundrum for you to put it out to the audience, because we social scientists are absolutely stymied by one case study out of the whole that I'll put forward in the last slide today. We can set aside the moment of the revolution, obviously after 8 years, 7 years of war and civil war, then 4 years of what's called the revolution and the civil war, with roughly 14 million dead. The revolution in the 2 capitals, concentrated mainly in the central industrial region, Moscow and 200 or so mile radius around it, did not represent this vast landmass that we talk about. And for the most part, what Stalinism represented was a reassertion of a socialist rule of law throughout the 1920s and 30s. When it failed in the 1920s, this is the reason for collectivization, in order to extend into these rural areas a direct ownership, if you will, associated with Comrade Stalin himself. What he does accomplish, we now know on the basis of mass source data, is roughly 6 times the number of party professionals in the Soviet Union throughout the 1930s are going to be Moscow appointees rather than originating through local areas. And that makes a huge difference when you're talking about the building of state authority, outsiders making a decision willing to cross these lines. Just to take one example, what is most fascinating when you visit the Museum of the History of, they say, KGB or the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but we're really saying the history of the Soviet secret police, what you find amazing is there are all kinds of, about 3 million orphaned children in the 1920s, many of them orphaned by communist power during the Civil War, and then they put them into special camps. The patron saint to these special camps is Dzerzhinsky, the leader of the secret police, and they socialize them, re-socialize them, and what we find when we do what's called prosopographic analysis, looking at the career patterns, the family ties, the cultural ties, private life of these individuals, almost without exception, they are the core of the Stalinist secret police under the period of the Great Terror in the 1930s, whose father is figuratively Stalin himself, and to whom they owe everything in life, to Stalin, to socialism. That will make for a cohort, when you talk about an authoritarian rule of law, willing to impose the kinds of violent restrictions on personal behavior that we've seen as the public sphere expands more and more into the private sphere, the very definition, if we go by Orwell, of totalitarian rule. Now, I promised you 2 case studies. Both of these are on the basis of my own original work inside Soviet archives and the like. Out of the last 30 years or so, I've spent about 8 years working in Russian, Soviet, Ukrainian archives. I married into a Ukrainian collaboration. His family didn't mean to, but that got me working on the war, because I had the good old boys of the Ukrainian nationalists talking to me in one ear, and I was reading the documents on the other side while they were open, and you see the lies and omissions that are associated on both sides with respect to what was really a blood war that we're seeing played out again today in the Euromaidan battles with Russia, in the battle between separatist states, in the battles over Crimea. The situation after World War II gives us an excellent example. The standard view in the West is that there is this universal rule of law inside the Soviet Union. Robert Conquest wrote that in the vast empty spaces in the North and the Far East, that very area I just talked about, areas as big as fair-sized countries came under complete Soviet secret police control. That, again, is a myth. It's particularly a myth after World War II. The transition from the period of German occupation to the period of Soviet reoccupation creates a special moment where we see the reimposition of a Soviet socialist rule of law over the course of that period, 1943 to 1950. Why? Really, there are 2 factors that are going on. One of them has to do, again, with the blood conflict on the Eastern Front. The fact that the Soviets are going to suffer more casualties than all of the other warring parties combined. Current reliable estimates are 27 million, 14 million civilian casualties, 13 million military casualties, 4 million, by the way, which the KGB says they did themselves because they had to get rid of rumor mongers, provocateurs, and Soviet citizens who were working as spies for the Germans. But all the same, we see the breakdown of society, even as we see Soviet success and the emergence of the Soviet Union as the second power of the world, but with an economy roughly 1/5 the size of the United States, which beyond Pearl Harbor, as we know, is never invaded, whose economy will expand 500% in the course of the years 39 to 1945. The United States will benefit, emerge as this nascent superpower. The Soviet Union will emerge as the second power of the world, but of course, far smaller economy, conventionally speaking, a very powerful country, but we know it immediately passes over into the nuclear confrontation. The scorched earth policy is what the Soviets called it as they retreated. They did not want the assets inside the Soviet Union to be turned against the Soviets themselves in the war with the Germans, so they destroyed everything. But they did it inefficiently, as we would expect. On the way back out, the Germans do the same thing, far more efficiently, and what we have then is a setback according to the mind-numbing data that's been collected about the effects and the devastation of World War II on the Soviet Union. Roughly 20 years of gross national productivity loss, aside from the human losses that we talked about. We add in about 25 million people invalided, so that there's the ubiquity of people without legs, without arms, suffering and begging on the streets of Russian cities, Soviet cities after the war. All of this is going to create the moment of lawlessness that I think is the greatest period of lawlessness, or the absence of a rule of law, in the history of the Soviet Union of the 20th century. New research that I've done from post-Soviet archives reveals that there was a vast terror from fear of criminal bands that suddenly emerged, that dominated the atmosphere of post-war Soviet society. This is obviously completely incongruous from the notion, that myth of Stalin having all this power. I just will quote largely what I can quote from our unpublished letters from communities or individuals to the local newspapers, and there are hundreds of thousands of these, talking about internal conditions because people think this is their newspaper, and also Soviet censorship. The Ministry of State Security was actively involved in censorship, collected this material as a means by which to keep their finger on the pulse of what was going on. And what we get out of this is a sense of this huge fear. I'll give you one example. This one from November 1945 in Podolska city, maybe 75 miles from Moscow. Marauding bandits and thieves detain peaceful citizens not only in the evening, but kill, undress, and rob them in broad daylight, and not only in the obscure alleyways, but on the main streets as well, even around the local Communist Party headquarters and the city Soviet. After work, people gather in groups in order to protect themselves on their way home. Thus, meetings after work are poorly attended because workers are afraid to remain, afraid of being attacked on the way home, and it is no longer safe at home, either because robberies take place there day and night. The sense of insecurity strikes all of the areas predominantly of the Soviet Union, but especially we find in the areas that are transitioning from a German occupation regime to a Soviet occupation regime. What's the problem? Every single male who is fit to battle is at the front, age 18 to 40. Therefore, they have to rely on invalided individuals, old elderly people, women and children to dominate, to manage everything internally, and of course, that rebuilding without livestock, because it's all been destroyed, without machinery, because it's all been taken away or destroyed, is nearly impossible, and the reason why the Soviet Union goes into a vast famine in 1945 and 1946. I just want to show you what the data looks like. This is the official data from the highest source inside the former Soviet Union. The data themselves were available in the summer of 1996 when Boris Yeltsin was running for re-election. By the end of that year, they closed up again. I've never been able to get access again because these are the vital statistics of the Soviet Union. And I did publish this piece in the Russian Academy of Sciences in 2001 or so, but heavily doctored because there was a desire not to share the data of vulnerability around it. The data themselves fulfill the myth that the Soviets typically have. Let's see if I can get this to work here on the screen. Yes, and what you see is roughly a decline overall. When you aggregate crime statistics, there's a blip during the war, but for the most part, the Soviets can maintain the myth by the 1950s that we have no crime in the Soviet Union. Crime itself is a bourgeois aspect because people are acting out in a way we don't have to do this sort of thing. I've had many a conversation with Ministry of State Security personnel about that very idea. But when you disaggregate the data, you see something fundamentally different as a comment about the rule of law in the Soviet Union. If you look at violent crime, particularly banditry, social banditry as it's called, and armed robbery, what you witness here is roughly a 547% increase inside the Soviet Union, corresponding to the very period I'm talking about, particularly the period of transition. What's going on? In contrast to the United States, we all have that image in our mind, World War II, New York City, the soldier, the sailor kissing the girl on the street, this sort of celebration. There is no parade for Soviet soldiers when they come home. They return home, usually more often than not because they're invalided, and they have nothing. They're not getting bonuses from the state, they're not even getting support from the state. And so, more often than not, they've kept their arms, and they organize into groups, and they begin to maraud, and they're bandits. The question is, for us, the lesson we can take from the lawlessness in an authoritarian state is whom are they attacking? And that, I think, becomes clear when we look at the data. This is 1946, the peak year of the attacks. And what we find out immediately is we've got on the left side the Russian Republic, RSFSR, 17% of all bandit attacks, violent crime attacks that year. The Western counties or states of Russia, roughly 9%, but it's really the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and especially Ukraine, that's getting struck with this rise of of bandit activity, because these are the areas that fell under control, but they're also areas in which Russians are not the predominant ethnic group. Other groups are, and they're fighting a civil war against Moscow. They were partisans, largely collaborating with the Germans. They would say not collaborating, but working against a common enemy, but we don't have to split hairs here. After the Germans leave, they're still there fighting for their own independence, now looking westward for Western intelligence agencies, Western governments to invest in the integrity of their resistance against the communists and their spread into their zones. But what we're seeing is official euphemization, I guess, of what's going on. But we see that the people who are being marginalized are ethnic and religious minorities in these zones. And that's one of the lessons I want to draw here. When you go into a state of lawlessness, people begin to prey on one another. The most ugly behaviors I've ever seen come out of World War II, say bounty hunters, who want to round up especially Jews, gypsies, other groups, and sell them to the Gestapo for 5 kilos of pig fat or something like this, so that you can enhance 15 buckets of vodka or samagon, moonshine. All of these things are operating in a kind of political economy of genocide and attack. The Germans are relying upon this popular collaboration. As soon as the Germans are gone, they're still preying on these groups because ethnic cleansing becomes the only solution because the Soviets aren't here. You haven't had a battle with them directly, so let's clean up those pro-Soviet elements in our midst. And they may be, if it's Lithuania, we're going to kill Poles, we're going to kill Jews. If it's Ukraine, we're going to kill Poles, we're going to kill Jews. You see that there is a certain logic to it, but what we're really talking about is marginalization of these groups in the midst of these situations. Let's go back from that because I want to draw a couple of the conclusions that we have from this study, and then I'll do a shorter version in the post-Soviet transition. The absence of the rule of law leads segments of the population to prey on the rest in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a federalist system of 220 different nationalities in 15 different republics. And so when everything's break down, religious and ethnic variation tends to create marginalized groups who get preyed upon. And those are precisely the victims of the crimes that I'm talking about in this breakdown of the authoritarian rule of law. Second, the absence of a rule of law strikes these marginalized groups disproportionately. What we're talking about is scapegoating in particular. We know about the European tradition of scapegoating Jews. There's also scapegoating of gypsies. There's scapegoating of Volksdeutsche, the ethnic Germans who had nothing to do with Germany, who lived peacefully in these zones for 700 years. Suddenly, after the war, 15 million of them are forced out of their homes, forced into the West, many of them showing up as refugees in another area. And finally, the chaos, the lawlessness, the end of a rule of law tends to generate extremism. That is in the form of ethnic nationalism. It is in the form of the search for someone who can restore the rule of law. And that's precisely what happens here. And this is where the genius of Stalinism applies, because what Stalin had is a popular cry for the re-imposition of authority in these zones, because we're all so afraid. People are writing that I'm more afraid now than I've ever been, and look at all the things we've survived, even the Nazis, and it's more terrifying on the streets now under Stalin than any other time. And so with people's popular participation and support, he reimposes an authoritarian rule of law that goes well beyond anything Stalin had constructed under what is considered to be the height of Stalin's power in the 1930s terror. The data for this, and these were the data that were suppressed inside of Russia, basically show that between 1940 and 1942, the proportion of informants about criminal activity, especially violent criminal activity, inside the Soviet Union, these are paid informants working willingly with the Soviet secret police, doubled in the first 2 years of war. They double again between 43 and 45. They double again between 44 or so and 1950. When they de-Stalinize in 1953, they take away maybe half. The intensity of the system itself, the reliance upon popular participation in their own self-regulation under authoritarian socialist rule is an extraordinary outcome of this movement to a suspension of the rule of law during the transition after World War II. Now, having introduced you, and because there's such short time, I know that I may go too fast, I apologize for that. I want to talk about the second case, the post-Soviet transition. Now, for this case, I focus in particular on Ukraine because I've testified 24 times in asylum court as a specialist on the region, and I began to discover patterns. And when I looked at the data themselves supported those patterns. Hopefully, you'll agree when you see essentially what I'm putting forward. What we found, first of all, is that the post-war or post-Soviet transition produced depopulation. And these data are just a few weeks old, showing the impact of the depopulation since the end of the Soviet Union in Ukraine, which had at that time a population in '91 of roughly 52 million people. By 2001, 10 years later, 6 million people had disappeared. When we looked around to see where they came from, well, here we're talking 2001, and you see, let's see, it doesn't show up well on this particular screen. Okay, there we are. So 2001 there, but as we see, it not only doesn't abate, but it actually accelerates. And then when we get to Euromaidan, cutting off Crimea, the separatist republics, we see a huge decrease in population as refugee populations are being produced, as the rule of law is no longer applied, as, what is the curious thing? Russian orthodoxy is being imposed by the Russian separatists because that's all they have to rely on anymore in the absence of a rule of law, religious extremism. These are the kinds of things that aren't reported in the press, but become very clear for social scientists when they begin to look at this issue. Back between, at the 2001 census is what really shocked us, and these were the data that I used in this publication that came out a few years ago in the International Journal of Human Rights. What you can see here is the 18% of the population of the Soviet Union was from Ukraine, but roughly 38% of its refugees who file for asylum are coming from Ukraine. What does that mean? Ethnically, who are they? Predominantly, you're looking at ethnic Russians coming out of Ukraine, being discriminated against in the transition from Soviet power to Ukrainian kind of rah-rah nationalism. And Jews. Jews go from being the third largest ethnic group of Ukraine, roughly 500,000 people. 400,000 Jews flee Ukraine in the first 10 years after the end of Soviet power. And yet the Western journalists are writing about Ukraine as a model of ethnic amity. And we know how much that model was in 2004 when President Yanukovych poisons, or the presidential candidate Yanukovych, poisons his enemy, political enemy, and eventually the entire election is reversed. But at that time, we begin to see this East-West paradigm between ethnic Russians and others, and we've seen how it plays out even more in the separatist battles around Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, all of these areas that have followed. The tendency in the West is to say this is all Russian-inspired. It fails to recognize the intrinsic role that's played in the battle to impose their own rules of law in these separatist areas because they're fed up with Kiev's corruption, incompetence, especially if they're predominantly Russian, as they are in the East. In the West, there are paramilitary groups being formed of these ethnic Ukrainian nationalists who regularly are trying to impose their own rule of law, including putting in stops, police stops, to find Russian spies in their midst. And they're actively pulling people out, beating civilians, beating foreign tourists as suspect in these contexts. The decline in population, specifically out of the former Soviet Union, shows, out of former Soviet Ukraine, I should say, shows here 3 million ethnic Russians just disappeared. It doesn't mean that they all left. It means they disappeared. And what demographers refer to, especially anthropologists, is the idea of ethnic self-annihilation. A typical example is your mother is Russian, your father is ethnic Ukrainian. The Russian side helped you a lot before '91, but that no longer serves you, so now you become a Ukrainian good old boy. You kind of erase this, you shift from one side to the other. The Ukrainian Jews were in that side as well, as I showed you. Immigration to the United States from the former Soviet Union included 637,415 immigrants. 1/3 of them or so came from Ukraine, and many of them, as I indicated, as victims of persecution. Economic hardship and forced migration is the very thing that Ukrainian social scientists emphasize. They completely ignore the fact that ethnic and religious minorities, again, are being scapegoated in a variety of ways. Why does this matter? Because, as I tried to argue in this article, is essentially the basic issue is that international asylum law adapted. Everything in international asylum law, and I'm a little bit tense here because I'm speaking in front of a bunch of law professors, but the entire idea originated back at the Geneva Convention, and it was based upon the model of Nazi Germany, where you have a leader who openly advocates the persecution of certain groups, whether they're homosexuals, whether they're gypsies, whether they're special needs, whether they're Jews. As just a few among many groups that are anathematized during that period. Throughout the entire post-war period, that was the definition. But there are a couple of cases, and I'll spare you those cases, but 3 of them, the 3 leading cases, all come out of Ukraine and are part of Ukrainian Jews being marginalized in particular that helped to break open not just U.S. asylum law, but international asylum law. In particular, one that was called the matter of Izzy and Ozzy, a Jewish Ukrainian father and son who were persecuted in a variety of violent ways. They basically, the U.S. federal courts argued it was no longer necessary for petitioners for asylum to prove that their host government actually supported persecution. Instead, they had to meet only the lesser burden of showing that the officials had been informed of the instances of persecution, but had failed to provide effective remedies to prevent further persecution. So in the absence of a rule of law, the international courts began to step in a big way to say, okay, we're going to redefine the relationship to persecution. We're not going to look for that higher burden proving the Ukrainian government is out to get you. They couldn't prove it. It wasn't true. But the Ukrainian central government was so weak, it could no longer protect its citizens. And that was the rule that followed pretty much up until the end of the Obama regime. Now we see everything changing topsy-turvy. So it really is more of an historical discussion than a present-day discussion because of the changes in views. One last thing, we'll take 2 minutes. The social science conundrum that I promised to present. All of this is about ethnic and religious cleansing. How in periods of transition, groups of individuals functioning in crisis societies prey on marginalized individuals. When we're talking about Jews in Ukraine, we're not talking about practicing Jews, we're talking about assimilated Jews who might have one grandparent who was Jewish, but they get sought out and money gets extorted from them, and eventually they're forced to leave. But before they've been beaten, their children have been beaten, their laundry thrown in the mud and the like. One region of the former Soviet Union, this is Galicia, which is a particularly interesting place with a long history in Western Ukraine, the one that I've done the most work. The pictures basically depict the beginning of the 20th century, showing the multi-ethnic heterogeneity of Galicia, which was basically maybe 24% Jews, maybe 40% Ukrainian, Polish, Gypsies, Roma that is, and others. There was that nice kind of mixture. In the course of the 20th century, by the time you get to 1959 is what's on the right side, essentially it is a homogeneous region. Ethnically homogeneous, in which by that time we're looking at about 90% ethnic Ukrainians. Today, it's 90, according to the most recent Ukrainian census, it's 98.5% homogeneous ethnic Ukrainian. What happened to people? The question that this poses is there are 5 different moments of transition in the rule of law that we've talked about in this area. After World War I, Volksdeutsch, ethnic Germans, are attacked and forced out of the region. A massive wave comes to the west. Many of them come to the United States or Canada or Australia. There's also attacking Jews then. After this, the region is under the control of the Poles between 1921 as a result of various treaties until 1939 when the Soviets come in and go after it. The Soviets created an open hunting season on the Polish pawns, the Polish bourgeoisie. It's no longer good, and so it depopulates the Poles at this time. After or during World War II, attacking Jews, attacking usually ethnic Poles then as well. And then you get into the 50s, and there's a resettlement of Russians, Poles, and Jews in the region because now the Soviet federalism supports that. You get to 91, depopulation again, with these kind of vigilante attacks, marginalization of individuals. 5 moments in history that lead to complete ethnic homogenization. Why is this a problem? Because social scientists can't explain it. It defies historical outcomes. You have not one regime, you have not one ethnic group that is managing ethnic cleansing, and yet we see that the one pattern that dominates and defines this region in the 20th century is ethnic cleansing, without regard to whether the Soviets are there, the Poles are there, or the Germans are there, or anyone else, Ukrainian national independently of it, whether it's a democratically elected government, whether it's a dictatorship, whether it's a military dictatorship, ethnic cleansing is the one unifying factor. And when somebody argued this back in the 1990s, Daniel Goldhagen at Harvard University, he failed to get tenure at Harvard because basically he said people killed Jews in World War II because they hated Jews because of anti-Semitism. To argue that, of course, doesn't fit a social science model. We historians have to understand, why did it begin, why does it end? If anyone has an explanation, I would love to hear it, because my colleagues and I are stymied. There is no model that exists that explains the intrinsic and inevitable effect of the series of moments of lawlessness in the transition throughout Western Ukraine in the 20th century to produce this outcome. That's it. Thank you very much.
I'm really glad I'm following this presentation on Russia because, in fact, what I want to argue is not that lawlessness means no rule of law. In other words, you could have law and still have a questionable rule of law state. And it's so great to have the Soviet Union and China side by side, because in China what we have is what's called the socialist rule of law. And essentially what it is positive law. That is, it's not necessarily an objective natural law, but it is an inherent difference in belief in what law is. And at least according to the socialist rule of law, it is law that is created by people as led by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese Communist Party is the vanguard and the true representative of the people. And so at the end of my presentation, we can really talk about, you know, this actually creates a legal system in China that works somewhat well. But is this truly a liberal, or what we understand rule of law to be? I love showing this slide to start because it reminds us, one, of the importance of China, right? You can see China in the world's economy with its tail ready to kind of push the US off the #1 spot. But also, it's important because China, in building up its legal system, very much did it for economic development. And it reminds me of what law, the multiple uses of law and what it can do. So, and certainly since 1979, China had opened it up, itself up, trying to move from a plan to a market economy, and law is very much part of it. And the West was thrilled with that idea. And there were lots of rule of law programs that were sent to China. I participated in many of them because law is synonymous with democracy. And the idea is that, well, if you need law for market economy, you're going to put in laws and it's going to be predictable. You have a contract system and people can plan their transactions. And indeed, that is exactly what China wanted. And markets will lead to greater prosperity. And greater prosperity leads to the creation of a middle class and civil society. And all along the way, law would teach the language of choice and what we call the grammar of justice to this middle class, because now the middle class have rights and they want to assert their rights, and they are so in power, and this civil society would use law to check abuses of power, what we understand the rule of law to be. Now that is the narrative that the West went and I participated to China. Now there's a competing narrative, which is that law in fact empowers authoritarian regimes. And that is that it legitimizes regime because you have it written down, and whatever the government wants to do, the law legitimizes it. It also maintains social control, and it controls lower level administrative agents, and it centralizes the state authority. And it also maintains elite cohesion, right? And that is that it, law can somehow give power to the elite. And so, well, which narrative really applies in China? And it's somewhere in between. Now, if you look at the rule of law definitions, there's really actually two aspects of the rule of law. And that is, one, law should govern a nation as opposed to being governed by decisions of individuals, right? And two, that all people and institutions are subject to and accountable to law that's fairly applied and enforced. And I'm going to explain and posit that in China, they've done very well on the first. And it is the second that's at question. That is whether or not all people and all institutions are really subject to law. But as to the first, that's what's happening in China today. And there is no lawlessness in China. But whether or not certain elites are controlled by law is questionable. So let's just quickly go through the history of the reforms in China. They started doing it in 1979 after the Cultural Revolution. The planned economy proved to be problematic. People were starving. And so in 79, you had this historic civil justice conference, and the Chinese government realized the need to create a legal system. And so for the next really 20 years, the Chinese were really great. They sent experts abroad, and they, and they did a lot of exchanges, and they reopened law schools, and they rebuilt the courts. They sent judges abroad, and the central state, even then, encouraged the use of courts and litigation, right? And because you have the economy, and people are starting to have disputes, and the idea was, well, maybe courts has a rule, use. One of the uses is to make sure that you can control the population, right? And so maybe you could use litigation to stabilize society, and that is during the 1990s and the 2000s, that's what happened. And then, of course, Chinese really got into it, and litigation rates soar. And so what you have is then fear of instability, and Hu Jintao then President of China had an agenda. And with each new CCP plenum meeting, there's a policy statement. And in 2005, it's harmonious society. And the idea is that you really, what the China's next 5 or 10 year goal is to build a harmonious society. And so what you saw then during that period is a retreat from the use of the courts and from the use of laws, and rather to use mediation. And then in 2012, which brings us today, Xi Jinping's Chinese dream and nationalism. And essentially what he's arguing for his political platform, and I'll explain how law plays into it, is to, one, comprehensively build a moderately prosperous society, to comprehensively deepen reform, to comprehensively govern the nation according to law, and to comprehensively, strictly govern the party. So interestingly, that he also sees the need to do that. So I put down what has been in socialist law theory, what socialist rule of law is, but I think there are really 4 characteristics of the Chinese socialist rule of law, or socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. And one is order over freedom. There's a real emphasis, and at some point we should talk a little bit about constitutional norms and cultural norms. But 1 is order over freedom. 2 is fragmented justice, and I'll quickly talk about each in turn. 3 is top-down control, and 4, the inevitable leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So what do I mean? Well, there's a historic and cultural preference in East Asia, perhaps. That is that there's a recognition that we prefer stability and order over freedom. And again, in the 2000s, we see both Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping emphasizing this, that courts are used to stabilize society and eliminate conflicts. So what you do have is mandates to the court to use mediation and give priority to mediation. And there are a wide variety of mediation mechanisms out there. And in fact, mediated cases jumped from 38% from 2008 to 65% in 2010. So don't we all want mediation? In fact, in the US, I would argue that maybe we could do a little more mediation than the adversarial kind of system. But the problem with mediation and preferring order over freedom is that sometimes this order is not necessarily voluntary. I mean, you could have mediation and the mediated outcome is not necessarily voluntary, and sometimes the judges lose credibility and hence undermine the legal system because the same judge in mediation is in adjudication, and it's hard to enforce mediated outcome. But most importantly, mediation compromises. It settles the immediate dispute, but doesn't set norms, which is what we want legal systems to do. And so it would leave the underlying social norms unresolved. Okay? But that's one characteristic of socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. Another one, multi-track legal system. Chinese are very good about putting forth a legal system and then segmenting it. So that means that small matters are usually quickly decided, like debt, quickly decided under an expedited procedure, or mediated. Business, commercial matters, full panoply of adjudication and protections. You can exchange evidence, you can get, a judge to hear the case, you get lawyers appearing on both sides. Social litigation resolved by courts under heavy governmental supervision. So it allows law to, deal with things, to handle civil and political disputes, keep people happy. But law is to stay out of political disputes. It allows limited challenges to the state, but maintains top-down control courts, right? So again, courts are used to resolve individual problems. So unlike in Soviet Union, perhaps, where there's complete lawlessness, you can say there's a legal system in China. Individual disputes get resolved. But for the major social norm type litigation, no. Top-down control, legal professionals are always treated like bureaucrats as opposed to independent professionals. So what you have is judges, they're part of a civil service system. They decide cases in a group, and their cases get reviewed by a central committee of the courts. Lawyers get under the purview of the Ministry of Justice and the Chinese Association of Lawyers, theoretically the bar, but it works very hand in hand with the Ministry of Justice, and their licensing gets reviewed, lawyers' licensing, and their cases under this 2015 regulation. If you're a lawyer, you're going to handle cases that are sensitive. You have to get permission from the prosecutor before you can interview your client. So that's the kind of top-down control on the kinds of cases that happens in China. Civil society, they've been enacting a lot of laws that actually regulate civil society organization very much through registration. So if you're a nonprofit and you want to operate in China, you're going to have to register with the public security, and part of that is to keep track. And again, on the use of courts, again, you have your individual contract dispute, come on down, they'll resolve it. In fact, they'll be happy to keep the economy going. If you want to bring a class action against the government for environmental protection, well, what would happen is that your case would get divvied up into individual disputants rather than group litigation. Your lawyer will be selected by the government if their political credentials are satisfactory. And your case will most likely be handled by the adjudication committee in the court rather than by the individual judge. So those are the characteristics, and part of the problem, of course, is this top-down control. Lawyers in China have a real hard time working, and they have a real hard time actually in numbers too. I just love the statistics. In China, for 1.4 billion people, they have 325,000 lawyers. In the US, for I think we have 323 million people, but we have 1,350,000. That's like 1 in 300 people in here are lawyers, whereas there's 1 in, I can't even do the math, but in China, so it's rising, but still not enough. You still have crackdowns in human rights. Lawyers, they don't necessarily get jail always, although there was just today, I think Yuan Shen is somebody who wants to litigate government in Beijing for smog, has been pulled aside for questioning, and the listserv is all buzz about that. But what they will do is deny you your license, your livelihood, and that's a very top-down way of controlling it. Finally, though, here's the crux of socialist rule of law. We, in the liberal conception of rule of law, want law to check political power, right? And that even politics have to subsume under law, because we have this objective natural law kind of check on individual powers. But not socialist rule of law, because they believe that law is not objective. It's always going to be a reflection of the economic class. And some of us kind of believe that too in Northeastern, right? That law is not always neutral, but that it's made by the people as created, as led by the CCP. And so the fourth plenum decision that was enacted in 2012 was really significant, because it's the first time that the Communist Party focused on law as their policy goal. And the fourth plenum decision essentially says we've got to promote, but notice it's governing the law, a country according to law. So and throughout that document, I think the CCP must have been mentioned like 60 times, but it upholds the idea of the leadership of the Communist Party. Again, law is the will of the people, and the party is the vanguard and representative of the people. And what it also sets up then is a dual constitution system. That is, you have the Constitution and you have the criminal justice system and the rights protected. But along with that is a shadow system of the party. And that's true of Chinese government also, is that in Chinese government, for every level of government, there's also a party cell. But the party has its own constitution, and it will discipline itself. And what this fourth plenum decision did was to actually recognize that. And that's pretty significant, that it recognizes that in China there's a dual system, one party and one law, but that the belief is that you do need that. And what's interesting is that actually the party system has become a little more legalistic. So maybe it's so that if there are going to be disciplines of party members, let's say there's a corruption case, there are starting to have regulations in these party disciplinary commissions. And so we are seeing perhaps a little kind of bleeding of the two systems. And actually, I just read today, and I don't have enough information on it, but the Chinese also just recently proposed a National Supervision Commission. They want to amend the Constitution. That is in charge of disciplining the party, but it will be apart from the rest of the legal system, but it will be recognized in the Constitution as a separate branch almost. So it will be interesting to see how that works. Okay, so my last slide, socialist rule of law. Well, yeah, they have a legal system. It works. It furthers their market economic reform, but it's not really political reform. It doesn't really check the party. And yeah, if you believe that the party is truly the representative of the people, then maybe the party is really the one to create the law. But what if the people and the party and the law conflicts? And at this point, there really isn't a supra kind of check on it, other than the own party's self-discipline. Again, so what I said was centralizes control, but no external checks. And law, unlike what happened in the various aspects of the Russian history, has been used to rejuvenate nationalism, cultural self-confidence, but it may ultimately revitalize this concept of rule by man, because yet again, where is that external check? So we could have more conversations about that, but again, the idea is that, yeah, it is a very much rule-oriented country. And there's not going to be this ethnic cleanse. It's not going to be chaos in the streets. But when the real big conflict comes, how is it going to get resolved? And I don't think the CCP knows that, and neither we.
Two very thought-provoking, rich presentations. Is open it up for Q&A now, and then at the end of our time, we will show the film, and those who want to stay, eat the last bit of popcorn and watch the film on the way out. But I think it makes sense while these great talks. So if we could get our speakers up.
Okay, before we open up entirely, do you have questions of each other?
I guess what I'm curious
You need
about.
a microphone.
You need a microphone.
Yeah, I mean, how much does that resonate, the kind of how China uses law to modern day Russia? I have a feeling not as much, but I want the expert.
No, part of
to it.
what my argument is that the extremism of a chaotic period produces the rule of law because there's popular support for the imposition of law.
Yeah, that's different from rule of law. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
so we go from vigilantism to
yeah.
state authority with popular participation in generating it. And just as Stalin is doing this after World War II, because he's facing the beginning of the Cold War, he's hiding all of this situation. Alan Dulles is perfectly aware of it because he has supports about it. They begin to try to exploit these fissures, as they call them, in these ethnic fissures in Soviet society, and he's trying to put a lid on it with popular support. Same thing Putin does, and I could name a dozen other examples out of Russian history, to use chaos and fear of chaos as a means by which to lead to an imposition of authoritarian law with popular participation, which is, of course, the great sleight of hand. People voting to end democracy. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. Okay, let's open up. Questions or comments?
So in America, Constitution is the most fundamental law, whereas in China, the party is above the Constitution. So do you make that as the rule of law or as a rule of the party by law?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big debate, right? Because there are some scholars who claim that the concept that law restrain, everybody is equal under the law, that law restrains all powers, is really a Western or a liberal conception of rule of law. And that is, you can have a thin concept of rule of law, which is essentially to use law to regulate society and so on. And so it depends on if you believe that, in fact, there is a differentiation between liberal rule of law versus rule of law should always encompass this idea that law can constrain abuse of powers. But what's interesting to me in thinking about this whole issue, and I've been thinking about it with Trump and in the US, is that ultimately, it's not the law and the institution, right? Because we can see Trump actually acting pretty arbitrarily. And in fact, it is the informal constitutional norms of self-discipline that matters, and somehow we've lost that. And we were talking about this book that's now making waves in the political science circle, and the book is called How Democracies Die. And essentially, the authors argued that there are two constitutional norms that have somehow been depleted, and that is forbearance and mutual toleration. And every single president has actually abided by that norm, and that constitutional norm is gone. And I kind of feel like that with China too. Even if you have the constitution or the party system, whatever, what it is that it needs its own self-discipline, and somehow the Chinese leaders do have it. I'm not quite sure the Russian leaders have it, but the Chinese leaders, at least so far, do want to govern, and they do want to self-discipline. So that's why they established this National Supervision Commission. That, to me, is actually an even more important constitutional kind of rule, more important rule of law criteria than a written constitution. In other words, it's the unspoken constitutional norms. And China, at this point, kind of doesn't have the document. We're relying on this informal norm to work. And so far, it's kind of working.
I'm talking about the Russian situation. In so many, you counted 5 transitionary periods. Obviously, they don't have time to institute formal laws. And Russian itself, you said, had a very low level of representation, bureaucratic. So in the short period of time, all you can have is common law. And if you recognize the limitations, you don't have to look at cleansing. You're just trying to do what you can with little resources. So the simpler is to just control people like you that recognize your power. So you want to eliminate anybody that's not going to, or you already know they're not going to recognize your power. So you're just trying to make a simpler system, one that you can manage. And it seems, I mean, in these transition periods, there's already viciousness. So that's outside. But it's just a simpler way.
Are you suggesting that ethnic cleansing is a management exercise in order to simplify
Yes.
how you manage your infrastructure?
In a way, yes, I would suggest that.
In a nativist agenda.
Yeah, in a native facility, it does make sense, actually.
You folks want to comment on that further?
A synonym of common law is also matlaw. You understand that because, of course, it's those who are willing to act are the ones who then have the power. And I can show you how that plays out in Soviet history. The last case of a witch burning in Russia was the end of the 1970s in a village that I visited in north of Perm, about 300 miles in north of Perm in the Ural Mountains. And the village rose up to get rid of this malevolent old woman who was bringing crop failures and illness and death to the children. It was also in an area where there was nuclear fallout, and that was probably what was causing it, and they burned her. Soviet law tried to restrict it by punishing the ringleaders, but they couldn't find anyone guilty because, of course, the community standard upheld the witch burning, and so nothing happened. I think that this is usually what happens in Russia, that the Soviet state is going to, and now Russian state, is going to impose its will where it may be absolutely essential from the point of view of infrastructure or something else, but for the most part, other things just kind of happen. And what that's created is, we know on the basis of post-Soviet studies, over 5,000 bandit gangs or whatever, organized crime groups function in Russia alone. That they begin on the local level to replace the state apparatus. And in testimonies of victims of persecution, that usually means that they are going to bathhouses, still a thing in spa life of parts of Russia, with the prosecuting attorney of the town, with the mayor of the town, and so you've got organized crime literally in bed with or side by side with corruption, corrupting of officials. And this seems to be the definition of what's going on in post-Soviet Russia, post-Soviet Eastern Europe generally. Ukraine, certainly that's the case. They're almost exactly parallel to that. So where is the rule of law there? You understand? The laws themselves, the central government began to, especially after 2004, under Yushchenko, after the Orange Revolution, the democratization period where America is invested in this Ukrainian president, Yushchenko, American wife from a suburb of Chicago, 7 beautiful children, and he signs a law to allow local political formations to have their own militias, for instance. And these militias then go out armed. They begin to celebrate ritualized holidays of Ukrainian greatness of one form or another that look like Nazi parades. And people are terrified. So I think that's really what's been happening, but there are those who believe in the rule of law in Russia today, but I don't see it at all.
So I can't resist trying to ask you some questions about what's happening in the United States, and I think there's some mysteries that your talks have raised. And one of them is, so violent crime in the United States has been significantly down over the last several years. We have not gone through a violent political transition. And yet, we see rising support, not for the kind of ethnic cleansing that you're describing, but for example, deporting the 800,000 dreamers. We have, although we don't have Communist Party rule, we have the Hastert rule. I don't know if you all know what the Hastert rule is, but it's a rule that Republicans have used in the House of Representatives since Dennis Hastert was the Speaker of the House, in which even when a bill would clearly command a majority of the House, and then if it was entered onto the floor, it would pass, the Speaker won't allow it to get to the floor unless he's certain that it can pass with just a majority of Republican votes. So that's very much of a party-based approach to government. And so my question is, what is happening in the U.S., in your judgment, that is leading to decline in forbearance and the loss of norms, to the ability of a presidential candidate to get up in front of the country and say, you know, if you walk down the streets of Chicago, you're going to be shot, and the world is where is this all coming from?
And I would just add to that question. There were concerns about the rule of law in, for example, the late 60s. And pardon?
February 5th.
Yeah, right. And part of the response at a community-based level was riots. Crime rates were higher, but there were riots. I attended the Women's March in New York this past weekend, and the language in many of the signs was some of the angriest I've seen anywhere ever, but it was a peaceful demonstration in the middle of New York. So at the same time, the question for me is, why is everyone still operating within a template, a context that says that even though there's that kind of anger, we're not seeing either the kind of violence that you made reference to, or quite the same kind of ethnic cleansing?
Amy Chua wrote a book maybe 10 or 15 years ago that looks at the democratization of countries with economically dominant minorities, and her thesis is that it would lead to great combustion, right? Because if you have economically ethnic minorities controlling all the wealth, and then you introduce democracy, and you have the majority who don't control the wealth, then you end up having great chaos. And what that says to me actually is, and what she said, well, why doesn't it happen in the U.S.? And one of the reasons that she posited it doesn't happen in the U.S. is mediating ideologies. That is, there is this idea that we believe that somehow we will get a shot at the at the fruit, and so at the rewards. And it may be that might be in part an answer to your question, is that we do have a mediating ideology that we think that Trump will get voted out, that it's gonna that politics would change and the people will win out, and so perhaps it's this mediating ideology that's keeping us from going into revolutions in the streets, and in part we might want to be thankful for that, but maybe we shouldn't be too self-congratulatory. We still have to work on it, but yet we don't see immediate chaos.
My answer is I don't know. And I don't mean that not to answer the question. The biggest question we ask when we look at the history of nationalism and ethnic violence in the 20th century is that one statistic. Beginning of the century, 20%, 2 out of 10, of the victims of war are non-combatants. By the end of the century, 8 out of 10 are non-combatants. 20th century transformed the meaning of war, in which non-combatants are now identified as the agenda, the target of modern warfare. So built in within this, those of us who work on ideological nationalism, the ethnic cleansers, as they follow the trajectory from childhood to, say, World War II, why did they suddenly start to perform neighbor against neighbor violence? And we don't have a good answer for that. I have communities I've discovered, interviewed, written about, in which some go and are hiding marginalized groups during World War II, Jews or Poles or Ukrainians, these groups that I'm talking about. But there are others who are just as willing to step up and cross the line to take them out and shoot them. And on an individual level, individual psychology figuring in these perpetrators, We don't have a ready answer, except we know that it happens. And when you see both sides stepping away from forbearance that you described, that we're crying out for, Antifa following the European standard saying Nazis don't have a right of freedom of speech, say, to demonstrate in the way that others have rights, you see that that too is controversial and breaks down into violence in the United States. And so I think the answer is that we have only just begun, and that the violence is going to escalate, rather than not, God forbid. But this is a, you know.
That's a sobering assessment. I get in the way you explain the story of the very sobering story of ethnic violence and authoritarianism in the 20th century in Russia, Eastern Europe. Right, the chaos leads to ethnic violence, leads to the authoritarian strongman comes in. I guess I want to just ask you whether, one, is that chronology always there, or do strongmen and can strongmen, are they part of, are they dependent or independent variables, and do they play a role, or what role do they play in fomenting the violence to which they then are the response? And so does it happen, is the existence or non-existence of the charismatic leader itself an explainer? And then the second question, more perhaps to the topic, is, you talk about law comes in at the end, but would greater internalization of the norms of the rule of law, can it be a countervailing force in some of these situations?
Thank God it is, to answer the second one, because I've been surprised to see that we haven't gone towards extreme violence faster in the United States. We do have Black Lives Matter leading to black on white police shootings and things like that, but it seems to get contained right away. Other examples of increasing on police attacks on African Americans. I was worried that a year ago that it would be much worse today than it has been, but maybe it was a cold winter that intervened again, especially in the South where most of this was occurring. The South has a particularly unusual period. On the first question, historians refer to these leaders as hingemen, cultural hingemen, I guess, people who represent the pairing of a moment. The Germans are moving into, say, Lithuania. You have the emergence of these Lithuanian nationalists who are willing to cross that line and advocate National Socialism to the level of perpetrating atrocities with their own hands on the streets of Vilnius or other cities. And that's not to single out that city, it's just the way the Second World War went. And not just against Jews, but again, ethnic cleansing of all sorts. That's what we've been studying the closest. And the studies are not yet out. I hear them in conferences all the time. I think that we'll know a lot more in 10 years than we know now. But obviously, when you're talking about individual psychology, the randomness of events among the survivors of that violence is the defining element in surviving, in the same way it seems to be the defining element among perpetrators, as far as I can see now. That is that there is no emerging pattern that says this member of the community is going to grow up to be a perpetrator, this member is going to grow up to be a victim. We don't have that. We only have case studies.
So that causes me to ask just one other question, and we'll get back to you. Boston, and I want to try to put this in a planning context. Boston is growing, as are a number of other American cities. And if you look at the demographics of that growth, most of it is not being driven by domestic birth rates. It's being driven by in-migration of immigrants, people from abroad, a large percentage of whom are people of color. And a number of our cities, Boston, Seattle, Chicago, whatever, and, have adopted housing policies and plans to address what most American mayors see as the key issue for their cities, which is housing affordability. We heard it last night in the governor's State of the Commonwealth talk, which means, in part, that a large proportion of what's being developed as new housing to moderate rents and the like is being developed for people of color and new immigrants. And that whether we declare it or not, many American cities are sanctuary cities, even by default, because in fact we're saying that we are prepared to protect the immigrant and emerging populations of people of color. So my question is, what distinguishes us from Russia and China in that regard within the context of a rule of law that presumably is part of that moderating force that says that we don't turn on our neighbors, and that in fact we're willing to accept a wider range of new neighbors who don't necessarily look like the people who've been living in those communities for extended periods.
There's nothing like that in Eastern Europe that I've ever seen. There are refugee communities. They tend to be isolated, and there's a lot of criticism where these are candidates for marginalization, nighttime attacks, this sort of thing. I haven't, in the case of, say, American expatriate communities where oil companies might be working in a particular community in Kazakhstan or Siberia, natural gas, this sort of thing, they live in elite gated communities, driving in the children to school in an elite gated school that has armed guards, to create a kind of cultural apartheid, not to mix the groups. And you don't see that intermixture of the opening arms and the welcoming of the refugees, even though there are so many of them.
If we look at the history of the U.S., I think we could say that much of that has been elite-driven, right? That the desire for labor, right? Even when we look at, where the Republican Party was on immigration until relatively recently, right? There was support for immigration. I'm not saying there weren't obviously many forms of wage issues and prejudice and dog whistling, but in terms of immigration, the Republican Party was supportive, it was populist, and I think one of the things that may be changing right now nationwide, but not in our urban cities, is the change in elites, and where we're getting party leaders instead of simply, the nativists, the Pat Buchanans, the George Wallaces, the nativists, the Father Coughlin's. They did not have the support of, they were not the leaders of national parties. But we probably should do it.
I am very concerned now as to what is happening with our immigrant population, because you notice, of course, that our fearless leader is talking about various parts of the world in very derogatory terms, and we have ICE breaking down doors and trying to collect children and trying to collect people, disrupting families and all of that. And it is reminiscent, I think, of the goings-on in Europe and other parts of the world when they were scapegoating. And I am very concerned about that. That is, in fact, getting out of control in this country. And what are we going to do about it? Thank you.
I mean, they've, I think that there's now recently accepted cert on some of, to review some of Trump's kind of executive orders. So we are concerned, and but the legal system actually has been pretty good on this, right? Maybe not fast enough. That's the problem, right? But any institutional steps isn't going to be fast enough. Political steps are fast, but institutional steps are not.
I have a couple of questions. One is, are there any comparative surveys that examine how satisfied the populations are in the United States versus China versus Russia with their various countries' versions of the rule of law in those countries? And the second question was prompted by a conversation I had with some Chinese visitors earlier this summer that I had met. And I said to them, is the reason why in China people are willing to accept less democracy and more rule by the Communist Party, is it because that has achieved great economic gains for them, and so they're less concerned about being able to speak their minds and our versions of the rule of law? They surprised me by saying, no, that's not it at all. That they felt that in China, people don't see democratic values like like voting in the same way that we see it. And the specific example they gave was, they said, China is such a large country, what, over 1 billion people? Imagine that there were elections in China that resulted in the kind of results we have in the United States, where it's often 51 to 49%. So you'd have huge numbers of people polarized on each side of the election, and that would result in lots of social disorder, and therefore you need some kind of central party that maintains the kind of order that you were talking about earlier. So the question is that
Okay.
valid?
Yeah, there have been studies done, and actually, of course, I think Wendy and Jeremy have referred to the World Justice Project that actually looks at rule of law in dishes country by country, right? And actually, China does not rank very high on that, but even as to empirical studies of ordinary citizens' perception in China and about their legal system, actually, and about their government, actually, it's not as dire as you think. They actually think that the government is, making the trains run on time, collecting the garbage, and so on. Having said that, though, I think one reason may be is that it is a relatively homogeneous population. So when you say the party leads the people, well, the people is relatively homogeneous. Now in China, there is the floating population, people in the rural areas trying to go into the urban areas and get some of the benefits, and that would be the closest thing to an ethnic minority you can get in China. I mean, there are ethnic groups in China. That's not the main Han Chinese, but the biggest threat to the Chinese actually is this internal migration. And that group has actually problems, and they would say China does not have the rule of law because they are not getting the representative voice, which gets down to your last point about elections. I don't always equate democracy with elections. I equate democracy with participation and representativeness. And so internal migrants in China don't get the representation for participation. Majority Han Chinese get participation. In the US, election might be one way of ensuring participation and representation, but there are other methods as well, whether it's the jury system or the notice and comment and so on. China has the CCP that theoretically represents the people, but it's also have been instituting very careful, and it might be, yet again, mediating kind of steps. They've actually opened up where when they have a law or regulation, they will post it for comments in the popular papers, and just to, one, to get temperature, and two, to get feedback. And so they are trying to give that sense of democratic participation, but not through the vote. And they actually are also trying to look how to instill a more systematic notice and comment system, and without having that system, run amok and having all kinds of comments come in. So they're doing a little. They're never going to do the vote.
So one way of thinking about it, I guess, is that all leaders, under democracy or not, right, need to do certain things to maintain legitimation.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you're saying China, the Chinese government seems, just listening to you, is doing a bunch of things sort of very carefully and maybe very astutely to give just enough participation to maintain legitimacy. I'm wondering, I can't resist asking you about Putin and whether, because from this perspective, it seems like it's just the strongman and veneer of election, but not perhaps this sort of more, what they call it, micro and astute ways of gaining legitimation. But I don't know if that's true.
Hard to speak on a theme that big, but it's absolutely clear that Putin has substantial internal support. What most amazes me among educated adults who have a history and a knowledge of history, families with several PhDs in multiple fields, families that have ancestors who were victims of Stalinist persecution, and yet they love Putin. And they say that democracy doesn't mean, these are kinds of sentences I hear, that you have a right to dissent. Democracy means you have a right to openly support your political leader. These kinds of, it's almost as if democracy is democratic centralism. And I sit back aghast. The worst part of the impact of the recent return to Cold War rhetoric for most of us Russianists is the loss, the lamentation of the chance of the 90s that we had. All of us have close friends, all of us have close associations, and you see as Russia has been isolated more and more, that instead of internal criticism, it's a circling the wagons response, that Russia is being blamed for Western problems, of stupid Americans being so influenced by Facebook fake news or something like that. It's not our fault, it's your fault for being such idiots to be led by the nose. And yet then they'll give me all kinds of fake news reports about things. It's a curiosity, but it is one that tends to structurally support internal Russia rather than the other way around. It doesn't support change in any way. And so I think that it's far more stable now, so that when you're looking for the totalitarian rule of law, I suppose it's there, and there's popular support for it. And this is 15 years after Putin began to use the war on terror as a means by which to suspend civil liberties and to clean up the mess, and everybody yells hurrah. I was curious when you had spoken before, the woman, fourth row or so, about ICE and how alarmed you were.
Yeah.
The equivalent of ICE in Russia, give you an example, the Tsarnaev brothers, after the Boston Marathon, had contacts all over Central Asia. In the war on terror, they went there and they killed everybody in the house. You understand that Russian counterterrorism is not the same as, okay, we're going to arrest you and remove you legally, deport you legally. It is, we are going to kill you and all of your friends and your associations. It's a far more hard kind of policy, and tremendous popular support for it, because people don't feel that they have any chance of falling victim to this. There is the feeling that if you are planning terrorist acts, then you must die.
But it seems to me as if once the next step with what's going on with ICE is to begin to do something like that. If the populace decides, or the ruling power decides that that's what needs to be done. The problem with me is, when does it stop?
Yeah, and we do have to remember that during the Second World War, we had internment camps for very large numbers of Japanese Americans, and that wasn't that long ago. The other irony that strikes me is that you indicate that Putin has large popular support within the country, and I'm reminded that two of our most recent presidents were elected with a minority of the electoral vote, In this country, and as much as we stress our democratic values, the fact of the matter is that we put in office people who did not, in fact, have a majority of popular support. And that raises some, I think, very hard questions for us.
Thank you. My question is, given this book about how easy democracy can be lost, and the particular, I feel like the academics, and I'm asking you this because you're all academics, have been disrespected, put it as politely as I can, not just by Trump, but by Republicans, the Republican Party. And are you concerned?
Yes, and that's why we have a week coming up on alternative facts and truth, and certainly one of the themes, right, is to what extent, what's the relationship between the rule of law and democracy and reason and, right, and sort of the academic pursuits and reasoned discourse more generally in a polity.
And I just had one other comment to go back to the professor's comment about being in New York and how the rally was peaceful and the signs were angry. I experienced the same thing, but I wonder if you have an opinion about this, that perhaps there's less anger because of the phenomenal increase in the number of women who are running for office. So people feel there's action, not just signs and marches.
Well, the linguistics and the visual linguistics are important, but I think that people were in New York and all over the country really demonstrating in part in support of the level of activism that has emerged through Trump and Me Too and Black Lives Matter and a range of other things. And we're seeing, I think, a reaction to last year's sense of shock that this couldn't have happened in our country. People have gotten over that shock. Well, some people have gotten over the shock, or more importantly, they've transferred that shock into a sense of action. And you see it in part in the media, and you certainly see it in organizing, and you see it in the significant increase in the number of women candidates. And you also see it in things like the announcement yesterday of the Academy Award nominees, and the substantial increase in the number of women both in front of and behind the camera who are being recognized for their talent and the work that they've always done but never got recognized for. But a lot of my colleagues have said that 2018 is a year for activism, and we are seeing that all over the country.
Why don't we take your question?
Thank you. We talked about President Putin. How can we forget President Xi Jinping? So my question is for Professor Wu. Since 2012, when Mr. Xi took office, he has waged this so-called anti-corruption campaign. We do see a lot of high-ranking communist officials being tried, convicted, and sentenced. I'm curious if you consider that as rule of law, and do you think that could really hold the power accountable?
That's a tough question, because certainly to have anti-corruption, that is, the idea that you will check against individuals' abuse of power, that is, that to use power for their own personal gain rather than for the public, it is a worthy goal. And the Communist Party in these anti-corruption campaigns have tried to do that. But the criticism of these campaigns are that, one, it's actually not reaching the most high level people, and two, that it is still done in a veil that's not transparent. And so to the extent that rule of law, you also want transparency in your rule of law, not just check individual kind of power, but then it does some of it, but not others. That's the case with China. I'm sure it's the case Russian. Whenever people ask me a question, I say, well, it's some of this and some of that. And so to the extent it checks some corruption, yeah, law would do that. And the party has done some of that, but it's not transparent, it's not reaching the highest level.
Very last comment, please be very brief. The film, I know these folks worked on literally nights and weekends. I haven't seen it yet, but I understand it's terrific, so I want to make sure we have time for that. So yes?
Well, thank you. I just take a moment to comment on that gentleman's information from your Chinese visitors about whether the population wants democracy in China. Although I enjoy your presentation, it's great, but I don't have comments on that. Well, I don't have the data, but I would argue that probably it's not true that the majority of the population won't embrace in democracy. One of the reasons we have, one of the information we have to bear in mind is that I believe the majority of the population do not know what democracy is. I've been studying Canada for several years, and I lived in Boston for several years, and I learned what democracy is from day one, because I was in a country where Google is banned, and Wikipedia is banned. I do not have any information about how democratic systems work. I believe that democracy is not about we all go out to elect our president. Democracy is everywhere in the corner of our society. For example, in a college like this, when a department decides to recruit a new assistant professor, every professor in the department has a saying. We have a committee, and we vote whether this guy's good enough to work as assistant professor. But in China, most people just don't know this. At a department in Chinese university, when we have openings for assistant professors, everybody just turn our head to the department chair or the dean, because this guy has the final say whether this candidate is good enough.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thanks again for staying, and thank you to our guests, Professor Birds and Professor Wu. Next week, we're going to explore the connection between the rule of law and economic inequality. We're going to be joined by two experts, Northeastern's own Barry Bluestone and Robert Kuttner, the founder and editor of The Prospect. For those of you following the news closely, Robert Kuttner is the person that Steve Bannon gave an interview to, which brought about Bannon's departure from the White House, so you can probably ask him about that too, if you look it up. But we're going to talk about the connections between the rule of law, politics, and economics, and we hope that you'll join us. Thanks again.
Spread the word.